Okay, all right. So, welcome. We have a smaller group tonight, obviously, but super happy to have everybody here. And the folks who are going to eventually watch this as it's recorded, welcome as well. This is the Faith and Humanities Forum, hosted by Colonial Church. And my name is Christian Wynn, and I serve as the teaching minister and theologian in residence at Colonial Church. The basic objective, I suppose we could say, for this project is, or the kind of the rationale, is the ongoing discussions that are happening in the broader culture, where we see the humanistic disciplines kind of being slowly but surely curtailed. We see humanities departments shrinking. We see people losing their jobs in the different disciplines. And so when having myself taught in a liberal arts institution before, and having a deep love for the humanities, both the arts and sciences, and also knowing about the history of the relationship between communities of faith and humanistic disciplines, it seemed like a good idea to think about, could the church provide a space where people could come in and they could share what they're working on, they could share insights and thoughts that they had, and from time to time connect that to questions about what does it mean to live the good life, and what does faith look like in regards to that. So that's sort of the rationale behind what we're doing here. This is our fourth session. We started back in the summer. I would say these first four sessions were sort of the experimental phase. And so now we've kind of gone through the experimental phase, and we are going to be pushing this in through the rest of the year. So if you are here with us tonight, whether you're watching the video after it's been recorded, or those of you who are here presently in a live format, next month in October, on the third Thursday, we will have a presentation that will be focused on music, on choral music in particular, that will bring in the choral director at our church, Elise, and then another layperson who's in the chorale, Jenny Baki. And Elise wrote her dissertation on choral music and colonialism in South Africa. And so there's going to be some interesting conversations there, both about the love for music and appreciation of that, but also an attunement to some of the social and political contexts in which music gets translated. And then we're going to have an anthropologist coming in November. We're going to take some time off in December, and then we'll come back in the spring. So that's sort of the schedule as it unfolds. I would I'm really excited, actually. I wish there were more people here live, because doggone it, Carrie Peffley deserves as many people as possible in the room. But I tell you, we are all in for a significant treat with Carrie. So first of all, I can say that not only were Carrie and I colleagues and on the same teaching team, and also working on scholarly projects together, but I just count her as a dear friend, and I think the world of her, and I'm really excited about the presentation that she's going to present tonight. So let me kind of read out the title. Well, actually, let me kind of do a little bio first, and then I'll read out the title. So Carrie Peffley is assistant professor of philosophy at Bethel University in St. Paul, and she specializes in medieval Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy. Her teaching and research interests include medieval Latin and Arabic philosophy, as well as contemporary ethics and aesthetics. Carrie is especially interested in the boundaries and relationships between philosophy, theology, and science, as well as the transmission of ideas across cultures, particularly within the monotheistic religious and intellectual traditions. The title of her talk tonight is Truth, Philosophical, Religious, and Practical. And without kind of laboring on the description, which you can find online, I'll turn it over to you, Carrie, and you can take it away.
Great. So should I go ahead and share the screen? All right. Oops. I'm going to go back and actually, wait. You may have to walk me through this. This is the first time I've actually done a PowerPoint from my laptop.
Yep, that's good. So now you can go up to slideshow on your screen.
There we go. All right.
Perfect.
And now we're good to go. So as Christian was talking to me about what you guys were doing in this series on faith and humanities, I figured as you guys are engaged in this conversation on faith, humanities, truth, beauty, goodness, and I'm a medievalist, and the medievals love to talk about truth, beauty, and goodness. So I was trying to figure out what I really wanted to talk about. I thought it might be interesting to really hone in on truth and philosophical, religious, practical conceptions of truth, and really to think about a variety of approaches to considering truth, the truth of, and the ways of kind of reading texts. And I think that my colleague Joy Doan has talked about this a little bit, Wayne Rosa as well. So hopefully this will play nicely with the people who have had these conversations with you before me. So what I'd like to consider, especially tonight, is really philosophical versus religious truth. But I should note that when I say philosophical truth, especially during the periods that I'm talking about, philosophy was much broader. And so philosophical truth would have included physics, optics, biology. So medieval philosophers were physicists, opticians, and also what we would now call philosophers, psychologists as well. So it's much more broadly construed in terms of philosophy. And so some questions that I want us to consider tonight, or some of the guiding questions, will be how should we as religious people consider truths from outside the faith? And these could be truths from other faiths as well as from outside any faith. And then how should we as believers reconcile our religious texts with texts from science and philosophy? And then narrowing in on our own faith, how should we as Christians interpret the truths of our own religious texts? So that's those will kind of be the guiding questions for tonight. So I wanted to begin, what I want to try to do is provide a few monotheistic approaches to answering these questions, which I hope will provide kind of a good foundation for fruitful conversations about truth. And I hope, again, as I mentioned, that this dovetails nicely with what my former colleague Wayne Rosa talked to you guys about last month. I think he talked about Raphael and the room of the signature, where you have kind of all artistically sort of visually represented in one room, kind of philosophical truth and theological truth. And this is the room where then the Pope makes decisions, right? Being informed by all of these different traditions. And I believe my colleague Joy Doan talked about reading nature as a text. So thinking about science and biology in that way. But of course, I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to focus on thinking about philosophical truth. So what I want to do is actually begin with what early theologians had to say, and to begin to understand the approaches to truth in the ancient world. And then I want to, because we're sometimes too close to our own religion to get a sort of distance, stability, I'm going to dip into medieval Islam for some of their approaches, and a thinker in particular, Averroes, and his approach to thinking about various approaches to truth. And then, because we're not in the medieval period, I want to bring us back to 21st century Christianity to then think about how we might apply this, and then hopefully have some conversation toward the end. I'm also going to try to pause every once in a while to see if there are any questions as I'm going along. And since I can see all of you, hopefully you can also just put your hand up if you want me to slow down, or if I breeze past a term a little bit too quickly, or something like that. So as you can see, early theology I find very interesting because they seem to use philosophy to help articulate religious truth. So it's seen as kind of a tool that can be used to help get at truth. So as we think about the roots of Christianity and kind of think about what they are, obviously, one of the roots of Christianity is Judaism. It's a religion that has its roots in the Judaic tradition, but it also has its roots in the Greco-Roman world. Maybe it's good to say it has its sort of adolescence in the Greco-Roman world, in addition to its birthplace. And so the questions that people in Christianity at this point face is, to what extent truth can come from both Judaism and the Greco-Roman world? Where are we getting our truth from, and how do we use it to interpret the various texts that we have? And for that matter, what's the relationship of the Old to the New Covenant? And which religious texts are the religious texts that we're going to actually say truth is coming from? And how do those various truths relate to each other? So it's a complicated world into which Christianity comes. So there are various religious texts that they're trying to work through, and various philosophical texts then that they're also trying to work through. And so this is a fascinating period, because when we're talking about, well, what we now call heterodoxy, or at that point heresy, versus orthodoxy, these are all involved in conversations about what truth is and what are the sources or origins of truth. And so the Greco-Roman world, what I want to say for a little bit is what's going on in that philosophical world, the Greco-Roman world at that point. So one of the dominant philosophies in the Greco-Roman world at this point is something called Middle Platonism. And so Middle Platonism is a philosophical school that's obviously influenced by Plato. And it's sort of late academy Platonism that goes all the way really through till about the late 3rd or 4th century with the thinker Plotinus, who starts New Platonism or Neoplatonism. So the dominant Platonist school was called Middle Platonism because it's in between Old and New Platonism, hence middle. What this philosophical period does is kind of combine Platonism with Aristotelianism. So it combines the sort of otherworldly thought of Plato, actually, and this works well with what Wayne talked about last week. He talked about the Room of the Signature, which has the School of Athens painting by Raphael. And in that particular painting, you have Plato at the center pointing upwards, and Aristotle right next to him pointing kind of around in the physical world. So you get kind of the little nugget of Platonism versus Aristotelianism. Plato saying reality is found in another world. We need to get out of this world. Truth is found in reason and the forms and these otherworldly things, versus Aristotle, who's saying, no, we learn from experience. Truth is in the world around us, and it's sort of a mix of physical and mental. Middle Platonism kind of smashes those two together. And it's actually kind of funny because they seem kind of incoherent, right? Plato and Aristotle are fighting with each other in that Raphael painting. The Middle Platonists see them as synchronous, as really, really working together well. And they sort of reinterpret texts that particular way. So the thing I really want to focus on from Middle Platonism is their conception of God. So the dominant conception of God, regardless of whether they were pagan, Christian, Jewish, whatever, and even before Christianity, their conception of God was a combination of Plato's good and Aristotle's unmoved mover. Let me see if I can get there we go. I know it's there somewhere. So the idea is God is, and Plato's good, so the idea of God as the good comes from Plato. And this is the idea that God, or the good, is an undefinable first principle according to which the entire universe is ordered. So the good is that by which we know everything, and that according to which all things are. So we all have our sort of ground of existence in this good, And we also understand the world according to this good. So that's Plato's kind of conception of the divine. Aristotle's conception of the divine, he describes in one of his works as the unmoved mover, or elsewhere, even more esoterically, thought-thinking thought. The point of all of this is that God for Plato, or the gods for Aristotle, rather, are very distant, transcendent. The unmoved mover causes things without being influenced at all, so moves without being moved. And so the Middle Platonists combine these two ideas together. The idea of this undefinable being that is utterly transcendent and causes everything in the world without being influenced itself. So this is the kind of the dominant view of God of this particular period. So what's interesting about this is that they start to articulate God and God's relationship to the world, because God, as the good or unmoved mover, is completely transcendent, totally unknowable, but the entire universe is organized according to that transcendent concept as its rational end. So the whole universe is ordered toward God as its rational end. But this God can't interact directly with the world, right? Because God is the good or the unmoved mover is completely transcendent. And so one of the other dominant ideas from this philosophical period is the idea of the logos. That what God does is exercise power in the world through the logos. And so there's this kind of transcendental dual world metaphysical system that develops, where there's a transcendent God who interacts with the world through the logos. And again, a reminder, this isn't necessarily Christians who are coming up with this idea. This is an idea that exists in Middle Platonism before Christianity ever enters the scene. But it's a pretty dominant view of God. And so early Christians then are coming from this Jewish background, but also this Greco-Roman background, and attempting to fuse them or think about them in some coherent way, or at least to make sense of these seemingly disparate origins. And so this leads to really a few different approaches to thinking about truth. And so I want to really talk about three of them, and I'll come back to these three throughout the hour that we have together. So the first one is rationalism. And so the first approach to truth is the best way to access God and truth is through the use of reason. And so the idea is God created the world rationally. The world is organized in a rational way. And so the best way to access God is through truth, because that means God has given us reason. So the rationalists are going to argue that reason is the best way to access truth. In terms of the early church, there's a figure by the name of Justin Martyr, who's well known for advocating this sort of rationalist approach. On the opposite end of that spectrum, and I should say I'm oversimplifying, very few people are totally rationalist or totally, this next term, fideists. Most people are somewhere in the middle, some blend of them. But fideism is on the opposite end of the spectrum. And a fideist is going to say that actually faith or assent is the best way to access truth. Really great early exemplar of this is Tertullian, who famously says, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" So the idea is, man, the Old Testament has nothing to do with these Greek philosophers. They're disconnected. Now, even he is not actually that extreme, because he actually uses Plato and Aristotle a lot. Nonetheless, he's trying to make this point that no, we ought to, in terms of knowing God's truth, we ought to rely more on faith. And then kind of outside of this particular spectrum, or at least the way I like to envision it, is the mystics, who say, actually, neither reason nor faith, a simple faith or assent, is the best way to access truth. Instead, a subjective religious, a direct experience with the divine is the best way to access truth. And Augustine, at some points in his work, The Confessions, describes these moments when, right, reason leads him to God in certain ways. The church helps lead him lead him to God in certain ways, but it's these moments with his mother in the garden where he has this direct experience with the divine, where he really, really begins to see who God is. So these are kind of three different approaches to what the best way to get at truth is. And again, they're sort of talking about what is the best option, but early Christians are dipping into all three of these ideas. So again, oversimplification, but hopefully a helpful one. So I want to pause at this point. Are there any questions so far? Anything that needs to be clarified or any comments?
We think, when I think of gods in Greek times, I think of the gods, the pantheon of gods. Mm-hmm. How does this concept of, it sounds like a singular God, relate to the pantheon of gods, and how do they relate to both of those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates did not have the same, I guess I like the thumbs up. It's a fantastic question. They didn't have the same sort of view of the gods as most ancient Greeks, or as the sort of the pantheon. So at least one of the speculations actually about why Socrates was killed or was put to death was because he rejected the pantheon. Socrates, so Plato's teacher, talked a lot about a personal god, a daimon who guided him, and so he was convicted of atheism because it was clear he didn't believe in that sort of system of gods. Plato also rejects that way of thinking about the gods. He's not really a monotheist as such, but he really talks about the divine as either the good, which you can see throughout several of his works, and then he writes a work called the Timaeus, which is his kind of creation story. And in the creation story, he talks about a demiurge, which is a creator god. So a god who kind of directly interacts with the world. And then Aristotle, his idea of the unmoved mover, he's not sure whether there are one or many, so he kind of leaves it up for grabs. But again, he's not thinking of the gods as like Zeus and Hera and Poseidon. He's thinking about a very distant conceptual god. So it's very different. They all had a very different view from the sort of the pantheism of their day. In fact, Aristotle ends up saying there could be as many as 47 or 55 unmoved movers, depending on how you do the math. And he ends up sort of humorously going into these like astronomical, like the heavenly spheres, to try to figure out how many causes of motion there might be. Great question.
Could you talk a little more about the notion of logos? I mean, we see that in the Bible a lot, and what was their concept of logos versus the Christian concept?
That is a great question. Actually, that question, if you guys are okay with it, that leads me directly to my next slide. So that's kind of a perfect place to transition into the answering that question. So what I want to kind of do to flesh this out, right? If we think about faith and reason as kind of compatible ways, at least in some way, to access truth, then what does this do for us? Well, I think there are kind of there are way more than three moments, but I'm going to focus on three moments in the early church that I think are helpful for thinking about how early Christians are thinking about their own faith, or how some of the early Christians are thinking about their own faith. This first moment gets into the question that you've just asked. And so I want to actually point to the passage in the New Testament where we have the logos used. So in John 1, the question in the Gospel of John in that prologue is, how do we deal with the idea that a transcendent God becomes incarnate? And so in this text, he's dealing with the problem of the incarnation. How do we make sense of a transcendent God coming into the world? So there was a really important, actually pre-Socratic philosopher by the name of Heraclitus. So pre-Socratic is just before Socrates. So Heraclitus was an ancient philosopher, actually from the city of Ephesus. So lived about 400 BCE. And he, in at least some of the fragments that we have, he says the following about the Logos. So he says, of the Logos, which is as I describe it, men always prove to be uncomprehending, both before they have heard of it and when once they have heard it. For all things happen according to the Logos, but men are like people of no experience, even when they experience such words and deeds as I explain. When I distinguish each thing according to its constitution and declare how it is, but the rest of the men fail to notice it. So what's really interesting about this section is he says the Logos is always in the world, but people don't recognize it. It's always been there, and it's this orchestrating, organizing concept, but men are unaware of it. And so Heraclitus, in his writings, describes this Logos as, he's kind of the first person to use the Logos as a metaphysical concept, as some sort of, not necessarily God, but organizing concept or a faculty of human reason through which we understand the world. So he's the first person to use that term. And you may have noticed from that particular fragment of his writing, that sounds an awful lot like the prologue to the Gospel of John. And so it's really, really clear that John, working with this Middle Platonic concept and this ancient concept of the Logos, thought, oh gosh, well, how do we describe the incarnation? Well, Christ is that Logos, and Christ is the thing that has always been there from the beginning, involved in the creation, but people have been unaware of it until this particular moment. So we see the sort of the same metaphysical reference, I would argue, even in the biblical text itself. So the idea is, when trying to explain how that second person of the Trinity comes into the world, the author of John seems to almost intentionally choose philosophical terminology to aid in explaining what would become known as biblical truth. Ends up coming in an interesting way from Heraclitus and from the Stoics and Middle Platonists who are influenced by his thought. So to continue to answer your question, the Stoics also, who Paul ends up interacting with a lot in his day, also were very familiar with this concept of the Logos. So does that sort of answer your question? Yeah, so it's one of my favorite passages from pre-Socratic philosophy that sort of makes its way into early Christian thought as well. So that leads to kind of a second moment, and this moment I'm going to point to is actually Pauline theology, found in Romans 10:4, where he asks, what is the relationship essentially of the Old and the New Covenant? And in this particular passage of Romans, Paul says that Christ is the end of the law. So what's the relationship of the law to the gospel? And Paul says that Christ is the end of the law. So there is a thinker by the name of Irenaeus, who, I just realized I don't have that on my PowerPoint. So that's let me see if I can spell. Yeah. Irenaeus, Irenaeus, who says what Paul was referring to there was actually Aristotle. And so he makes this reference in one of his theological works to Aristotle to help. He says Christ is actually the telos of the law. So the word that Paul uses in Romans 10:4 is that Christ is the telos of the law. Telos was a concept coming out of Aristotle. So Aristotle, in one of his works, had described 4 kind of causes or explanations for all substances. And so even like a pen, or say this teacup, in order to sort of properly explain it, I need to give all of the causes. And so the first cause that he talks about is the material cause. And that's just the material out of which this is made. So my first explanation of my mug of tea is the ceramic material out of which it's made. But of course, that's not sufficient, right? That's not all that my mug is. We also need to describe the shape or the structure. And this Aristotle calls the formal cause. And so that's the particular shape. But beyond that, in order to really understand it, we need to understand the moving cause, right? And this is ultimately what leads Aristotle to an unmoved mover. But like the efficient cause or the moving cause of my mug is Whittard of Chelsea, the British teacup company, is the moving cause. So I need to understand the ceramic, I need to understand the shape, I need to understand the maker. And then his most important cause was the telos. And that is the purpose, the function, the goal. Aristotle calls it that for the sake of which. And so with this particular cup, it's to hold tea so that I can drink it, I suppose, and to kind of look pretty, right? So it might have two telos. So that's sort of what we're aiming at. And for Aristotle, the telos is the most important of these causes. To really understand what something is, we need to understand its purpose. And so what's interesting is Irenaeus is writing his commentary on this section of Romans. He says, when Paul says that Christ is the telos of the law, he doesn't mean that Jesus stops the law. He means that Christ is the fulfillment, is the purpose, is that for the sake of which the law exists. And so he's making a very, just a beautiful theological claim, like the old covenant is not dead, it's fulfilled in this person. And he uses Aristotle to describe this and tries to make the argument that Paul actually meant that, which is, I think, a really interesting way to go about this. So then the third moment is a really interesting thinker by the name of Clement of Alexandria, so another early church thinker. And I've actually got his full quote for you here so that you can see what he's talking about. And he's explicitly talking about the different sorts of truths that early Christians are working through at this point. And hopefully you can fully see this. I'm going to move. Oh, does that actually work so that you guys can see the full quote? Can you guys see most of the quote? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think individuals can also collapse down to a single screen.
Oh, good. Okay, excellent. So he says, a philosophy was necessary for the Greeks for righteousness until the coming of the Lord. And even now it is useful for the development of true religion as a kind of preparatory discipline for those who arrive at faith by way of demonstration. And demonstration there is a technical philosophical term that means the use of syllogistic reasoning or kind of logic. So people who arrive at faith by way of philosophical logic. For your foot will not stumble, here citing Proverbs, if you attribute to providence all good things, whether belonging to the Greeks or to us. For God is the source of all good, either directly, as in the Old and New Testaments, or indirectly, as in the case of philosophy. But, and then he plays around with an interesting idea here, but it may even be that philosophy was given to the Greeks directly, for it was a schoolmaster to bring Hellenism to Christ, as the law was for the Hebrews. Thus, philosophy was a preparation, paving the way for the man who is brought to perfection. And there the term he uses is telos, by Christ. This is one of my favorite passages of any early Christian. The idea here is that God communicates to people in ways that they can understand. God speaks to everyone in a way that they can understood. And so his kind of explanation here is that the Jewish part of the world understood the world through law, and so God gave them the Torah. The Greeks seemed to understand the world through reason, and so God gave them Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And Christ is the perfection of them both. And again, the telos, the end, the purpose, the goal. that toward which they were all moving. And so God gave both the Old Testament and Plato and Aristotle in the same way. So this is quite the claim, that God actually kind of inspired Plato and Aristotle in the same way as he inspired, say, Moses and Isaiah and David and all of the ancient Jewish writers as well. And so this is his sort of claim, is that, again, God will speak to people in various ways depending on their needs. So in light of these three moments, we can see that early Christians approach scriptural truth in really interesting ways. Understanding the Bible means understanding varieties of literature and of the literature that's incorporated into it, and realizing that there are different sort of forms of God speaking to us. Sort of going back to these three moments again, and I think kind of takeaways from these three moments. First of all, right, the use of that some of the biblical authors even choose philosophical terminology to be able to communicate to their audience more directly. Another great example of this is Paul at the Areopagus in Acts 17, where he ends up pointing to this statue of the unknown God and says, I see that you guys are very religious. Let me talk to you about this. So let me use the things around that you guys are already comfortable with to talk to you about the truth I'm going to share. The second moment, sort of really emphasizing that understanding biblical truth can be aided by understanding philosophy. And I'll move on to this again elsewhere tonight. And then third, the idea that God communicates to people in ways that they can understand. And I think you put these three moments together, and you see that maybe some parts of the Bible are meant to be understood as communicating a deeper truth and tapping into other forms of truth, whether they be philosophical, scientific, and others, as we'll see. So I wanted to pause here again for any questions or comments before moving out of the early Christian world. So I can move on. So I think all of this stuff is very interesting and helpful, I think, but it may still be too close to where we are for us to view it clearly. And so, you know, I as a Christian tend to have so many assumptions built into my reading of scripture and the way I think about truth, that I can be sort of blind to my own assumptions. So what I'd like to do is turn at this point to the Muslim world, the medieval Islamic world, to get some helpful perspective, and especially from one particular thinker who I think gives an interesting approach to understanding the variety of ways people approach truth. So before we get to that particular thinker, though, I want to talk about early Islamic theology in sort of comparison to what I've just said about early Christian theology. So early Islamic theology is the term in Arabic for theology is kalam. And this is actually the word for word that ends up becoming known as theology. And so kalam is the speech of God. And there's an idea in early Islam that all knowledge comes from God. And in fact, and all knowledge is a manifestation of the mind of God. And in fact, this is so much the case that they refer to the period before Islam as the age of ignorance, the age before God in his fullness was revealed, before the full knowledge of God was understood. And so the people who are studying the Quran are called the mutakalimun. These are the theologians. And what's interesting about early Islamic theology, or one of the things that's interesting about it, is that it arises in conversation with Judaism and Christianity. So Islam comes into the world in a place where there are a lot of Christians and Jewish thinkers around. And especially during the early Islamic Empire, there was a great deal of openness. So Christians and Jews were living in the Islamic Empire unoppressed. And there are actually public debates that happen between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So it's kind of a fascinating philosophical period. But this means that there's always this sort of interreligious dialogue, conversation going on. And there's a realization that scripture then has to be interpreted. And that this idea of interpretation is ijtihad, and it's seen as a blessing from God to keep us from dogmatism. So there's a conversation after Muhammad and his companions die. How do we interpret the scriptures? How do we interpret the Quran? Muhammad is no longer around to tell us what he meant by this particular passage. And that immediately leads to some conflict, right? And some disagreements. But this is seen as a blessing from God, because God has given us various interpretations to keep us from being dogmatic, to keep the conversations going. So the fact that scripture does need to be interpreted is a good thing. So we see that in early Islamic theology. So those studying the Quran then tend to have, we're going to see, three very familiar approaches to truth in terms of scripture and things outside of scripture. So we first have a group of Islamic theologians who are the Mutazilites, and they think that God has organized the world according to reason, and God has given us reason, and therefore the best way to get to truth is through reason. And so they are our rationalists. We also have, as we saw in the early Christian world, fideists. And this theological school were the Asherites. And they believed that a more literal interpretation of the Quran and assenting to certain principles of faith was the best way to access truth. And then again, similar to what we see in early Christianity, we have a mystical tradition. The Sufi are going to argue that actually a direct subjective experience with the divine, that's the best way to get to truth. So all of them are accepting the Quran as scripture, but again, sort of thinking about, well, maybe though reason is the best way to access God and truth, or maybe no, a literal interpretation of scripture, or maybe no, instead a mystical experience with the divine. So we get, the point of all of this is to sort of situate what I'm about to say, but also point out that the conversations that were happening in early Christianity also happen in early Islam. As this new religious text comes to being, they're trying to figure out, how do we relate to the religion that came before us? And how do we relate to the philosophy and science in this part of the world that was available? So very similar conversations. Any questions before? That was kind of a very quick primer on early Islamic theology. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Here we go. Yeah, Carrie, question. You've described the mid-Platonic sort of conceptual milieu as being the tools, if you will, through which early Christianity understood and expressed its faith. Mm-hmm. Is there, by way of analogy or comparison, a similar, any descriptor for the environment, the intellectual environment, the worldview environment of early Islam? My sense being that it was not mid-Platonic at all, mm-hmm. but something else.
Yes, fantastic question. Yeah, so there is, right around the time that Islam became sort of a major empire, or associated with a major empire, they happened to choose this location that was kind of in the middle of the empire, and found Baghdad. So the city Baghdad was founded during the early Islamic Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate. And that particular place had beforehand been kind of a podunk town where a whole bunch of experts, Syriac Christians who were experts in Aristotelian logic, had fled to escape some of the Byzantine rule. And so they were, the early Islamic Empire, the sort of milieu that they entered into was really a much more Aristotelian one. So not Middle Platonic so much as really strongly Aristotelian. So what we're going to see deeply influential in the Islamic theologians is the role of Aristotle's philosophy. So that's a fantastic question.
Can I ask? Yes. Yes. My question is on the part of the lecture you gave on the roots of Christian theology, or the ideas that were used by Christian theologians or church fathers, because they incorporated this ancient Greek thought and things like that. And from a sociological point of view, ideas are always kind of rooted in their social context. We cannot just assume that they exist in social vacuum. So I'm just wondering, as somebody who grew up as a Christian in Africa, and I remember when you were just making the presentation, how my mother was teaching me the Bible and all these things. So she didn't know anything about this. And I started wondering, I have taught in Guatemala also for some time, and I'm just wondering whether if somebody who is going to be a Christian in another part of the world is going to really engage this, it's almost like they would have to abandon a lot about themselves to immerse themselves in another historical tradition in order to make meaning out of it. And we don't know by the time they do that successfully what they are going to be like. Because it depends on, are they going to abandon their own maybe history and then fit into this way of reasoning, or are they going to find a way to synthesize, to combine, or whatever, or something like that? So I'm just wondering, what do you think is the implication for this for Christianity in the 21st century? Because this is a very, very difficult question. I think for somebody like myself, I can understand because of the training I received in the West, but I'm just imagining when we talk about evangelization and things like that in different parts of the world, how can they fit into this kind of conversation? Even with Islam, I can see this in Africa, in West Africa, for instance. Many Africans would not be familiar with the rationalists, the Fides, Muslims, and the Sikhs. It's only when I came here that I became familiar with that. So that's just my question.
Yeah. Well, I think your question taps into a really, I think, a deeply interesting idea about the extent to which religion is connected to identity, and how much one's identity maybe changes and whether or not these changes are required to become part of a new religion, and whether or not this background is necessary to become part of, do you need to really have this knowledge of rationalism and fideism and all these sorts of things, or is there a simpler way to get about it, or is this necessary, or is this like a fuller way to get about it? So actually, I love that you asked the question in that way, because that actually leads really, really nicely. You guys it's like I've had you guys set up with questions that lead me to my next slide. So I'm going to jump to the next slide to kind of engage with that question.
Okay.
So to sort of answer your question, I want to get into this thinker Averroes, or Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Rushd is his Arabic name. Averroes is the Latinized version of that, and this is an image of him in Cordoba, Spain, which is where he was from. So this is during the period of the Islamic Empire where they had spread all the way up to Spain. So he is a Muslim philosopher from Spain who dies in the 12th century. So he's a 12th century philosopher. And he is really deeply interested in these questions, and writes a work called the Decisive Treatise. If you get a chance, it's a really easily accessible text. You can find it on Amazon, I'm sure, for like $12. So I would highly recommend it. Really interesting text. And its aim, his goal is to examine from the standpoint of religion, whether philosophy, and again, philosophy here is philosophy and science. So it's going to be philosophy, science, anthropology, optics, logic, psychology, neuroscience, all of these sorts of things are wrapped into it. So does scripture, does religion allow us to do philosophy? And it's kind of an attempt to give religious obligation for philosophy. So it's kind of indirectly a philosophical treatise. And it sort of gets back to that second moment that I came to in early Christianity, about the question of whether or not how exactly philosophical and religious texts connect. So he begins with this question of, does the law allow us to do philosophy? And his answer to that is yes. It's absolutely important. It's absolutely allowable to do philosophy. So scripture does allow us to study the world around us. And then he pushes the question a little bit further with, does the law command us to do philosophy? And he says, well, you know, if teleological, and here he's using that Aristotelian term, so teleological, if sort of purposive, intentional, goal-oriented study of the world is philosophy, and if the law commands such a study, then the law commands philosophy. And he continues. So he says, we say, if the activity of philosophy is nothing more than the study of existing beings, and reflection on them as indications of the artisan, that is, inasmuch as they are products of art. For beings only indicate the artisan through our knowledge of art in them, and the more perfect this knowledge is, the more perfect the knowledge of the artisan becomes. And if the law has encouraged and urged reflections on beings, then it's clear that what this name signifies is either obligatory or recommended by the law. So the law commands such a study. So he says, if the scriptures say that we ought to study the world around us as part of God's creation, and what philosophy and science do is study the world around us, then that means the scriptures command us to do such a study. So taking a very strong stance here, but Averroes had been influenced by various theories of intellect. And so as he's thinking about this question, okay, so the scriptures command us to do philosophy and science. How do we properly use and integrate it? And I might add in Samuel's question here of, and how do we relate that to people's identities? How do we sort of make those connections? So because Averroes was deeply influenced by the Aristotelian tradition, and the philosophy and religion that had come before him, what I'm going to present to you as Averroes attempts to answer how we integrate these is actually kind of Averroes bulked up by some of his Arabic predecessors. And so Averroes ends up in the Decisive Treatise, so the same text. He says that there are 3 different ways to truth. Now, he does not mean by this that there are 3 different types of truth. So he's not advocating a multiple truth theory where multiple truths can be contradictory but still true. He's instead saying there are different ways we get to truth, and to the same truth, he wants to argue. And so the first path is a term that I've used before. It's the path of demonstration. And this is the path of demonstrative logic. And so these, he said, provide us with truths of reason. And so the demonstrative method, he said, is the method of the philosophers. And so through the use of syllogistic reasoning, so they'll use logic and scientific methodology, and we get knowledge produced. And this is achieved by folks, philosophers, scientists, grasping the intelligibles or what can be known through the full capacity of reason. An earlier thinker had said, the philosophers are like those who grasp the sun in itself. They see the thing in itself. This is different from, but compatible with, what he calls the dialectical method. And this method was actually introduced by Plato. But here he's really using it to refer to theologians. No offense, Christian, but he's going to give you a different path to truth than the philosophers. And so this, he says, leads us to truths of the law. And this is because the dialectical reason, or the dialectical method, he says, begins with certain assumptions, right? So it begins with some assent to a religious text. And then you use the inner senses, he says, to get to what that inner sense means of these scriptures. An earlier thinker ends up saying that the dialectical method is going to be like someone who is out of a cave and can't quite see the sun yet, and so they have to look at it in a reflection in the pond. So they're grasping an image of the sun itself. So that he's making some clear references to to Plato's allegory of the cave, if you're familiar with that. Then he says there's a third path called the rhetorical method. And the rhetorical method is the method of the masses or the literalists. And I'm going to, for a while, sound very painfully elitist. So forgive me for the next few moments as I sound a little bit elitist. So this is Averroes. Averroes is going to say, this gets people to a symbolic representation of the truth. So they're not using a methodology that's quite as rigorous as the dialectical, nor one that's quite as certain as the demonstrative, but they're still getting at truth, but it's kind of masked in symbolism. And this, he says, is like grasping the sun as reflected in the water as seen through a mirror. So it's a reflection of a reflection of the thing. And so we're all three of these are still getting at the sun in this particular metaphor, but they're doing so through a different way, and they're getting closer and closer to that reality, but they're all seeing the same thing. So again, does this mean that there are sort of different forms of truth or different types of truth? Well, he says all three of these are in accord. Probably his most famous passage from the Decisive Treatise is where he says, truth does not oppose truth, rather it agrees with it and bears witness to it. So the idea is all three of these methodologies work together. They're all ways of viewing or accessing truth. And in fact, he says, the scriptures use all three. Sometimes the scriptures speak to us through symbolism. Sometimes they speak to us dialectically, and sometimes they speak to us demonstratively. So we see all three of these paths or these methodologies in the scriptures. So they're all compatible, and one truth doesn't oppose the other. Rather, it agrees and bears witness to it. But we all know, and he knows, examples of where it seems like scripture and, say, science contradict each other. What do we do when the rhetorical path and the demonstrative path contradict each other? Well, he says, since they do seem to contradict sometimes, it must be that there are inner and apparent meanings of scripture. And if we do see contradiction, we need to reinterpret the scriptures allegorically instead. But he also is not sure that everyone should do this. So again, I'm kind of obliquely working around towards Samuel's question, that maybe it's not a good idea for everyone to seek the demonstrative path, even though it's going to provide us with the most justification. So all three forms are necessary because, again, kind of like Clement, he's going to claim that God speaks to people in ways they can understand. But he thinks the demonstrative is most justified in terms of scriptural interpretation. Okay, so to kind of make sense of this, I want to dig into, and this is going to sound very strange, but a medieval Robinson Crusoe story to get at kind of a little bit about what he's talking about and sort of flesh this out. So this is this is a contemporary of Averroes who writes, I'm not even kidding, a philosophical narrative. So it's a philosophical novel written in the 12th century. He is also a Spanish philosopher of this particular period. Again, you can find this this is a photograph of the actual book cover that I have. So his philosophical narrative is called Hai Ibn Yaqsan, which just means alive son of awake. So that's what the name signifies, a person who is fully awake to the realities of the world.
Oh.
So I'm going to now just sort of walk you through the story, and I've given you the names of the three main characters so you can see who I'm talking about. So Hai is the main character. So Hai, the main character, lives alone on a desert island. And Tufa actually speculates on how he got there. So either he is spontaneously generated. So he says the biologists think that he was spontaneously generated and just poofed into existence on the island. Or maybe he got there a la Moses in a basket of reeds. Either way, he says that doesn't matter. What matters is that there's this person who's living on a desert island all by himself. He is the only human there. When he arrives on the island, or when he is born on the island, he is raised by a deer, a doe, a deer, a female deer, right? So she is his mother. And he is raised by her. And when she dies, Hai is really, really upset that she is no longer moving around. She is no longer living. But he starts to wonder at that point why she died. Why was she moving around yesterday and now she is not? So this leads him to some scientific inquiries, to some dissections, to try to figure out what's inside a body, what makes it work. And this leads him to further conceptual discoveries about sort of matter and form, the Aristotelian sort of conceptual stuff about, right, it's not just the material, but there's also form and there's also causality. And so this leads to him to a discussion or a sort of thinking about cause and effect, potency and actuality, unity and multiplicity, all of these philosophical concepts. And he then arrives at a concept of an unmoved mover, a one being who started it all. And when Hai thought about this highest being, his sense of self faded away. His self was obliterated and he saw nothing but the divine in this sort of meditative state. So important to know then, Hai, dude who lives on a desert island all by himself, and he's practicing mysticism, but he got to mysticism through Aristotelian philosophy, right? So that's sort of part one of the story. On a neighboring island, there's a group of very religious people led by a king by the name of Solomon. So Solomon is the king of the people on a neighboring island, and this religion was sound. Absal is a friend of the king and practices religion, but also feels like something is wrong with his society. He's not quite sure what it is. And so he ends up taking a trip to this neighboring island to try to be isolated for a while and meditate. And on this island, he runs into Hai. They're both kind of freaked out by each other's existence. But after communicating that they mean no harm to each other, Absal starts to teach Hai human language by pointing to things and communicating the human names for those things. Eventually, once Hai learns human language, they start to talk about what their lives have been like and what they believe. And Absal realizes that the discoveries, those conceptual discoveries that he's come to, are the same things that are communicated in his own religion. Absal then describes his own religion, and Hai thinks, oh, yes, that is like what I believe, but why are you using all of that weird symbolism to talk about these deeper conceptual truths? And so Hai says to Absal, I want to go to your island to talk to the people on your island. I'm fascinated by this, and I want to try to talk to them about pure, unadulterated truth. Absal says, that's probably not an awesome idea, but sure, I'll accompany you. So they go back to Absal's island, and on this island, Hai goes first to the most educated people on the island, and he gets agreement, good conversation, until he tries to push beyond the literal meaning of the scriptures. At that point, Tufa says the people shunned him, choosing instead to distract themselves from the truth by commercial activity. So they went back to their consumer-driven lives because that is what they wanted. So it's this great description. Hai then has this sort of realization that maybe these people, maybe religion and this sort of symbolic representation of the truth is good enough for this people group. But he also thinks this is problematic because they're so distracted by commercial activity and materialism that they may misunderstand their own scriptures because of it. So Hai and Absal, sort of frustrated with the consumerism on that island, end up going back to Hai's original island to practice mysticism in isolation. and that's the end of the story. So it's a really bizarre and fascinating, again, sort of medieval Islamic Robinson's Crusoe story. So I actually wanted to pause at this point and ask you guys, what do you think of this story, and what do you think the conclusions are that what are we supposed to learn from this particular story? And do you agree with what we're supposed to learn from the story? Yeah, David.
I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
Get us going. How do we talk about God? How can you talk about that which is beyond ourselves and beyond words? On the one hand, and that's the mystical tradition. Mm-hmm. That's the mystical impulse.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is, has God spoken? Has God, to put it this way, condescended to us? Has God chosen to speak from God's self to us in a way that we can understand? Mm-hmm. And what's the role of language in that? That may be so far off of your question and this parable. My apologies.
No. I think no. That's,
at least somebody's got it going.
Exactly. I need someone to just like put themselves out there and get us started.
Oh well.
Yes. No.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So part of one of the things that sort of has always kind of puzzled me, and I just don't know enough, is the fact that for a period, and I'm not sure how long, there is no real codified Quran, right? And I wondered often, like, when, and I haven't really spent enough time exploring it, but when exactly is there a settled text? And I don't know. I've been kind of sitting here for the last 20 minutes trying to think about what is it that I'm trying to ask when I ask that question, because you could replace the category truth simply with scripture, mm-hmm. or the Quran within a kind of Islamic conceptual framework, right? And so this could be different hermeneutical approaches. Or you could say, okay, we need to rely more on our ability to engage external sources, like whatever comes to us through reason, because we know that the text itself has been unstable, or if there's some sort of residue of history there. I don't know. Part of it's like, how does that figure into these different approaches? Obviously, by the time we get to this period, things have moved on, 400 or 500 years, but that's still pretty young. I mean, it took like 300 and something years for the Christian canon to settle.
Yeah, to be settled.
And so I guess part of me is like wondering, like, is that a component part of this, or is this just sort of questions about truth that is just this kind of this sort of disconnected, I would say, from the actual sacred text that these communities are using?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good, very broad sort of set of questions. The Quran was codified a little bit more quickly than the Christian scriptures were. Some close friends of Muhammad started to work on an official, kind of a quasi-official version of the Quran fairly quickly. So within a few hundred years, a little bit more quickly than the Christian scriptures. That said, so those different sort of theological schools of religious interpretation pop up because of this question of, well, I mean, are we supposed to interpret it literally, or ought we use reason? And actually the Mutazilites, these rationalists, they were the earliest theologians. And the Asherites, the Fideists, actually formed They were formed by a man by the name of al-Ash'ari, who had started out as part of that rationalist tradition and thought, these folks are moving so far into a metaphorical interpretation of scripture that we seem to be losing any connection to its actual meaning. And so he started the Asharite school instead. So that's going on. What's happening here, though, with at least Ibn Tufail, and certainly with Averroes. So Ibn Tufail is interesting because, as David brought up, right, the sort of the mystical ideas, God is so far beyond the apparent meaning of scripture, but also reason, right, that, you know, we need to get beyond all of that to this mystical connection. So it's all sort of less good. Averroes, I guess we would maybe describe him as I go to the mosque because that's what it's culturally acceptable to do, but I don't actually, like, this is mostly allegorical. So he's going to not necessarily be pushed toward mysticism, but toward science instead. He's a really a strong rationalist, who will argue as well that Muslims have long been arguing about the sort of apparent versus inner meanings of scripture. They only disagree on what passages of scripture to interpret allegorically. So outside of the historical sort of criticism, they're not necessarily thinking about Islam or about the Quran as not being inspired or inspired in the right way, but rather, at least Averroes' view seems to be, the Quran is all inspired, but it teaches us these three different paths to truth, and different Muslims disagree over which passages of scripture to interpret allegorically. But he immediately foresees some questions from the more conservative Muslims who are going to say, you're not taking the scriptures literally enough. You're just reinterpreting the scriptures as you want to. And he'll say, well, you're reinterpreting the scriptures as you want to as well. We just disagree over which passage to interpret metaphorically. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's sort of, it's partially part of the conversation, but it's also a very broad question of how do we make science fit together with the revealed truths.
And I think it sounds, I mean, part of it says, I tend to think historically, genealogically, and like each of these traditions don't just show up, you know, fully formed.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to hear that the Mutazilite then is the first one, which would make sense, because if you don't have a fully formed scriptural text, then yeah, you're going to want to use your reason, right?
Right.
What should we do?
Yeah. And I think,
yeah. I'm sorry.
I was just going to sort of affirm what you were saying and say, and especially because these early theologians are also in conversation with Christians and Jewish folks who had centuries to develop their theology already, and had used, clearly, right, the Christians were all experts in Aristotelian logic, so that would have seemed very comfortable and natural as they were trying to figure out their own identity with relationship to these older texts as well. So it's a very complicated question of text and identity. And also,
but isn't the Quran essentially written by one person, as opposed to our Christian scriptures, which is has much more complicated Genesis?
Yep. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's all, I mean, the Quran is all revelations or recitations of Muhammad at different periods in his life, but all the same person. And then there are additional texts that pop up that are then up for interpretation in terms of who wrote them, whether they're authentic, whether they were written by followers. But the Quran itself, all written by one person. Yeah, so what's going on? I mean, I would sort of argue, and I'm not a historian of theology, I'm a historian of philosophy, but certainly looking back on that early church period, like when Christian is talking about the canon really coming together, that process had to just be so incredibly complicated to figure out which gospels get into the Bible and which ones don't. That process, I'm sure, was very, very difficult.
Well, and some of it, I think it to me, like I just finished teaching a class on these early, like the first 2 centuries of the Christian movement, and having kind of immersed myself a little bit more in the more recent scholarship, you kind of see how complex and diverse the Christian movement really was. And
Yes.
that part of the argument about the sacred texts is also an argument about identity and boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that's the question I'm kind of wondering about, is that same dynamic at play here?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it's got to be a little bit different, obviously, because it's, you know, it's a different context and set of questions necessarily. But like, because my understanding of Islam is pretty thin. I've got some knowledge, but not that much. And so I don't understand fully is there an early diversity that has to be worked through? And is that part of what we're seeing when we see this? Like different approaches to the question of how do we arrive at what is true,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we, and which then informs how we're going to act, how we're going to be Muslim
Right.
in the world, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the answer is, to an extent, it's similar. There are similar questions of identity, boundary. I mean, and there are different schools in terms of whether or not Christians are really the same as Muslims, or different. So even in terms of how Muslims relate to the other monotheistic religions, there's a diversity of approaches there. But that codification process of at least the scripture of the Quran happens a little bit more quickly. So there aren't quite as many. The process there is a little bit more simplified and a little bit faster. What I should say, some of these conversations are coming out of actually the hot topic of this particular time period, sort of comparable actually to the hot topic for, say, evangelical Christians when I was growing up, was whether or not whether or not God created the world or whether it evolved. The medieval version of that was whether or not God created the world at some point in time, or whether the world was eternal, because Aristotle had taught that it was eternal. And Averroes spends some time responding to a theologian by the name of Al-Ghazali, who argues that no, we need to interpret the scriptures more literally. God did create the world at a particular moment in time. Actually, in this particular philosophical narrative in Hai Ibn Yaqsan, one of the things he sort of meanders through in terms of, so his mother, the doe, dies, and then he dissects her and then starts to think about, conceptual discoveries about matter, form, potency, actuality. And then he starts to think about creation versus eternality. And Tufa describes him as wisely choosing not to take a side because he could see merits in both sides of the argument. So it's clearly politically potentially problematic to get involved in such a hot topic debate. And then he moves on to just thinking about mysticism. But Averroes will end up arguing, no, if you take Aristotelian principles, God didn't create the world. You have to have an eternal universe. And so it's actually some of the things that are driving these conversations are these disagreements between a literal reading of scripture and what Aristotelian science was teaching. So that's kind of one of the big things that's at least going on at this particular point. But again, you're going to have different approaches to that. And so Al-Ghazali is going to come down on the side of science isn't reliable. We ought to have faith. He's also a Sufi mystic. So ultimately, he's going to opt for a more direct subjective experience with the divine. But he's a little bit more cautious about the truth that comes from philosophy. In fact, he calls metaphysics the fruitful breeding ground of all of the errors of the philosophers. He does not. I feel
like I remember reading that when we taught that class together. So
yes, yeah, I think we did. Yeah, because I think we worked through that section of text where Al-Ghazali just rips into some philosophers. Yeah, so it's highly contested, this particular, but it's a question of not interreligious text, but rather or intertextual criticism, but rather what do we do with these texts that we have that seem to say something different than what science presents to us. And I think, so David's question as well, or comment about language, I think is super interesting, because another kind of aspect of this particular story is that somehow this guy who never knew language actually understood God better than the island where language had developed, and they had all of these, the idea that human language somehow falls very, very short of who God is. And that's going to mean both religion and philosophy, right? So any sort of religious symbology is going to be problematic because it's going to use human language, as well as philosophy, which maybe is a little bit better, but still not nearly as good as this non-linguistic direct experience with the divine.
I'm going to have to sign off. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. Wish I could continue talking about it. I have another meeting at 8. Bye. Thanks.
Bye, Elaine.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Carrie, how would you see this connecting to sort of current realities or challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this kind of connects back to Samuel's idea. So, you know, when I teach this text to my students, one of the things we talk about is what are we supposed to get out of these three paths? So Averroes says that so let's move to here, right? So we've got these demonstrative, dialectical, rhetorical. In terms of thinking about this more contemporarily, you know, I think we can say some people are going to approach truth through science and philosophy, some through assent and scripture, and some through just sort of a more simple faith. And we can interpret Averroes in an elitist way, where he's going to end up saying, oh, those silly little people who can't be bothered to move or aren't even capable of moving beyond persuasion, are just sort of silly, and we just leave them there. I like to interpret it as through sort of and this is going to sound super weird, through a feminist lens, and say that we view it as actually kind of a pedagogical or educational model, that maybe what Averroes, or if we interpret Averroes for the 21st century, maybe everyone starts out with this more simple, right, with the flannel graph version of Christianity, and then an ideal Christian education is going to get them to think about God in a higher way, in whatever way, right, whether it is through assent, scripture, science, philosophy, whatever path is the way their mind sort of approaches God. So that's kind of the way I like to approach it. Partially because I think if we take Averroes too seriously, that we ought not challenge a simple faith, right? If we're like Hai Ibn Yaqsan and we're like, okay, these people are so obsessed with materialism and their simple view of religion, I'm just going to go back to an island and live by myself. It's sort of my impulse right now to actually go to an island and live by myself and escape from everything right now. But I think the feminist lens is going to say, you understand and appreciate people for who they are unless it's harmful to others, and then you try to carefully meet them where they are and lead them into sort of not harming others and moving past that simple faith if it is harmful to others. And that sort of turns it into a more plausible kind of pedagogical model. So that's kind of the way I would apply it.
That's really, I see Samuel's got his finger. I just was going to say that's really helpful, because when you were talking, I immediately was thinking about COVID.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and like these three approaches, are they equally legit for applying to the truth of how we should respond to that reality? And if you construct it in the way you're talking about, it does give you sort of a way, at least, of integrating them, not necessarily seeing them as equal.
Right.
Anyway, I'm sorry for interrupting you, Samuel. Go ahead.
I'm just, when she was explaining, what came to my mind was just another way to think about this is, okay, I agree. I think these three approaches are very fascinating and very interesting. But Jürgen Habermas came up with this idea that all knowledge has human interests behind it. Okay, So if somebody is using a methodology, and as just Christian said with regard to COVID or whatever, there are all these differences of ways. But for me, what is of great importance is what is the human interest that is shaping someone's predisposition to go for this or to go for that, or even if they are going to combine the three, what is the kind of human interest behind that? And the danger of that also for me, or the reason why that is very complicated, is that sometimes when you read the literature, you find out that human beings can be driven by a certain human interest that, unless they are very reflexive, they may not even be aware on their own that there are all these other forces behind the scene that are driving them to be this, to be that, or whatever. So, like, for instance, in the church, I would argue that in terms of how people really approach scripture or whatever, it is impossible to understand contemporary Christianity today without appreciating how the consciousness of the market consciousness has kind of, in a way, colonized human consciousness in a way. And this is not just an American problem. I have seen it with Pentecostalism in Africa. Sometimes you see the way people just interpret even scriptures. They may be using one of these approaches, but when you really look at it, you feel like there's a human interest behind that, and that human interest may not be religious. So for me, what is the human interest? And you mentioned some of the human interests, like the feminists, for instance. Their human interest comes across very, very clearly. But there are some people who would not even make their human interest very clear to you, but behind the scene, you know that that approach to knowledge or to scripture is driven by something hidden.
Yeah. And I think in many ways, even Tufail's story, and especially if you read the parts where Hai and Absal go back to his island, he's getting at that idea, the danger, especially, and he's most concerned with the rhetorical path, because he sees that as most sort of suspect or susceptible to, right? You could have bad persuasions, right? Different human interests could lead in very bad directions, as opposed to the more sort of self-aware or reflective, dialectical or demonstrative approach, which seem a little bit safer to him. And that's, I think, why even Tufail describes them as, like, what have they been influenced by? What's their human interest? Consumerism, right? They are only willing to accept what God has to say so long as it doesn't interfere with there is no sort of capitalism or market interests at that point, but it's pretty clear that's kind of what he's getting at. They're obsessed with their consumer-driven lives. The way they've got scripture, the rhetorical path, allows them to keep doing that, and so it's okay. So I think that's a really good point, and one that these thinkers are concerned about, for sure.
Well, Carrie, thank you so much. I wish we had had a more robust audience live-wise, but I have a good feeling.
I love the audience we had. They were great.
I know, yeah, we got some really, everyone in the audience actually interacted, which is awesome.
Yes.
So I'll be posting this on YouTube and making it available, and I'll be sending you the link, and anyone else who's interested in the link. And you can share it around with different friends. Our next episode will be also on the third Thursday of October. It will feature it's still sort of, I think, being worked out, but it's going to feature a consideration of choral music and its context in colonial settings. And so there'll be some interesting, I think, political and sociological kinds of engagements that are going to go on alongside of just trying to appreciate music and its beauty. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and hope that you can join us again next time. If you want to know what we're doing, check out our website, colonialchurch.org, and we have several other things happening, along with conversations around faith and justice, some Sunday school things that are happening. I'm going to be teaching a class on kind of a political reading, actually, of early congregationalism. I'm not telling everybody that that's the way it is, but that is kind of the way that it's kind of shaking out to be in terms of what I've been discovering. So anyway, thank you again, Carrie, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. Thank you.
All right. So if you want to stop screen share,
Oh yeah,
I'll
there we
turn
go.
off. There we go.